Okay, so having established the effect of a tariff in terms of exports and imports when we have a large country and a small country, what we want to do now is have a look at the welfare effects of tariffs. So, as we did before, the analysis depends a little bit on whether there's a large country. Again, remember that with the large country, the tariff impacts on the world price and therefore the world equilibrium, or whether it's a small country where it makes no difference, doesn't move the world market, and so the tariff, the full amount of the tariff is imposed. When we talk about welfare effects, we're going to obviously talk about consumer and producer surplus. And obviously, I'm sure all of you know about consumer and producer surplus. Very quick recap. Consumer surplus, remember, is the difference between the price the consumer is willing to pay, what they actually pay, whereas producer surplus is the difference between what a firm is willing to supply the good at and what it actually gets to sell the good at. And so we're going to use those concepts and also bring in the concept of obviously dead weight loss to look at the situation here. So let's take the large country now. Again, I'm not going to do the full model with the home and the foreign and the world market. Just remember, it basically takes it from the previous video where remember that the previous price was this PW, this world equilibrium price. Here, this was the full size of the tariff here. Whoops. That was the price. Remember that the P star T was the price that the foreign producers would receive, and the PT is the price that the ultimate price that is charged in the domestic market. Just going to label these areas here. I'm only going to look at the change in welfare, not the overall stuff. So what we're going to look at here is the change in consumer surplus. Now, again, I don't want to draw all over this diagram because it's confusing enough or complicated enough. But remember that consumer surplus before is sort of with the world prices, all of this area here, down here to PW and across. So that difference between what the consumer is willing to pay and what they actually pay is that, and you sum all that up. So once the tariff is imposed and the new price is this higher price here of PT, what we're going to see is the new consumer surplus is just this area here. And so the change is this area A, B, C, and D. And it's a loss, it's a minus sign there. So of course, one of the offshoots from this, as you would imagine, with the higher prices, that consumers in the home country, I should say, are worse off because they have to pay a higher price. So there are people who would have been consuming this good who are no longer because of the higher price, and that represents a loss of welfare. There is, of course, also, though, a change in producer surplus. For the producers, the effect is positive. So they were producing, remember, this S0 here when the world price was at PW. The higher price allows, if you like, more producers to be competitive and sell this good. So now the domestic production increases to S1. And so the producers are going to gain. Again, before and I don't want to draw all this in, but the producer surplus before was this area below PW and above the supply curve, so this area here. Now with the higher domestic production, it's this area here from PT and below to the supply curve. So the change is this area here, and it's positive. Again, tariffs are often imposed to help domestic producers, so it's not unreasonable to surmise that there's going to be a positive effect on producer surplus. There is also, though, of course, the issue of government revenue. The government earns revenue. Now, we're not going to treat this as a loss. It's a transfer of surplus, not a loss of surplus. So it's, and we kind of just need to assume that the government spends the money relatively wisely, and so it's a transfer, not a loss. Remember, the government is always going to collect the full amount of the tariff, even though the price has only gone up by a proportion. They will collect the full amount of that tariff. So that's why the change in the government revenue from zero, obviously before there was a tariff, the government revenue was zero. With the tariff imposed, the revenue that they're going to collect is the size of the tariff per unit multiplied by the size of the imports, and that's D1 minus S1 there. So it's area C and E, that blue purpley kind of area there. So what's the net effect? Well, we've got the loss from the consumer surplus, the gain from the producers, plus the government revenue. Some of these cancel out. The A's cancel out, for example. The C's cancel out, so they cancel out. So what we're left with here is a loss of areas B and D plus E. So area B and D is the efficiency loss. That's what we've always called dead weight loss of the effect. That's because the higher prices mean that there's a misallocation of resources. There's consumers who, in terms of this area D, consumers who should have been or could have been consuming this good and deriving benefits from it, but with the higher price aren't willing to pay that higher price, therefore they miss out on the good, so that's a loss of efficiency. A little bit less obvious here is this area B, but basically there's an overproduction of this good in terms of the domestic market, and that's equal to that area there. These are firms that really shouldn't have been producing the good because they weren't competitive at PW, but now are, because the higher prices allowed them to allowed their higher costs, if you like, to be covered from the higher price, and so they produce where otherwise they wouldn't. Now the area, so that's the deadweight loss. The area E is what we call this terms of trade gain, because the relative prices have changed. The price here you can see is PT has changed. So the gain depends on the ability of the large country to influence the world price. So in other words, see how far they can drive this down. Yeah, and so the more they can drive that down, that price down, the more they'll gain. So in other words, whether this area here, this E, is greater than the loss of efficiency. So it is potentially possible that a large country can gain from the imposition of a tariff because of that terms of trade effect, that it'll allow the government to earn some revenue, whereas otherwise they wouldn't be. As I've drawn it, you can see it's probably a gain for this country. In other words, area E probably is bigger than B and D, but that of course depends on depends on the slopes, the responsiveness, and depends on how large the effect is of the country. In other words, by how far they can drive down that export price. Okay. Now the analysis for a small country is a lot simpler. Yeah, there's obviously no terms of trade effect because it doesn't change the prices, the world price. In that sense, remember, it doesn't move the market, so it doesn't drive down the price that the foreign producers receive. They are still receiving PW. The whole of the tax, the tariff, is, remember, passed on to consumers in terms of the higher price. So that's the full amount. And so the analysis is similar, but of course we lose that terms of trade effect. So as before, the change in the consumer surplus, it was all of this area here down to PW across for consumers. With the higher price, basically they lose this area A, B, C and D. And so again, consumers are worse off. There is similarly an increase in the producer surplus because again, it has allowed these additional producers domestic producers to produce. And so producers are going to gain some. That's that area A. So again, that's fine. That's a transfer from consumers to producers. And there is also that gain in government revenue. The full amount of the tax multiplied by the size of the imports there is going to equal the tariff revenue. And again, remember, we consider that to be a transfer, not a loss of efficiency, because the government will then spend that money on whatever, ports, roads, schools, etc. That leaves us, though, again with these areas B and D, and that's the same as before, and that is pure, if you like, deadweight loss of efficiency. Remember, there's no terms of trade gain here because the tariff is passed on in full, so it doesn't affect the foreign price, in other words. So in this situation with a small country is unambiguously worse off. Yeah, worse off to the extent of the areas B plus D. Yeah, so that makes a difference. And what we're going to see later is that The effect of these tariffs will be different. It's different when the US puts on a tariff uh, relative to when, say, Australia puts on a tariff, or New Zealand, a smaller country. So it matters who's doing the who's imposing the tariffs. And so you've got to be very careful when you're doing this, that you bear that in mind when you're looking at tariff policy. Now, if you've got tariffs, these are a pain. No one likes to pay them, okay? It's a cost. It poses a cost to the importer. Firms often can spend time and effort to get around the tariffs. There's different ways, of course, over the years that people have done it. I haven't mentioned here, but one of the ways previously was that a company, a foreign company, would actually come what's called behind the tariff wall and actually set up a plant within the domestic country, basically because it meant that they can avoid the tariff. If you're producing in that country, then you don't have to pay a tariff. So they would actually set up shop. They realised that it was better for them to incur the costs of setting up an established manufacturing plant, for example, within the country, rather than producing them in their own country and then trying to export them to these other countries. This is one of the reasons why, for example, Australia has or had Toyota producing here, Mitsubishi in Adelaide. These were never Australian companies. They were set up in order to sell cars to Australian consumers and get around the very large tariffs that were imposed on imported cars historically. And of course, it's not just the fact that a tariff exists, but how big the tariff is. So the more discretionary, the higher the tariff, the greater the incentive to cheat. So a couple of, these are trivial examples, but these sorts of things happen a lot around the world, and typically just reflects a desire, if you like, by the importing the company that is exporting into the domestic economy to avoid the tariff. So the first one is declare rice as mung beans. So two Philippine companies, the Plum Blossom Import-Export and the Full Story Source Marketing companies, were apparently importing rice from Vietnam and Thailand. But the thing was, of course, is that rice imports required a license, which is a type of trade barrier, but is what we call a non-tariff barrier. But on top of that, it was also subject to a 50% tariff, 50% duty, and then on top of that, 12% VAT, which is essentially GST. So that made the costs of importing or exporting the rice to these countries a lot more. However, for various reasons, number one, that it was written into the ASEAN Free Trade Agreement, mung beans were zero rated. In other words, had no duty, had a 0% duty and 0% VAT imposed on it. So you put all the rice in barrels and say, yep, they're mung beans. You skip the tariff, you get to avoid the tariff in that way. Now, of course, they got busted, so didn't end up working out all that well for them. But that's the lengths that sometimes you go to get around these tariffs. Another one from a manufacturing type example was Yamaha motorcycles. And they arrived, again, we're talking about the Philippines, arrived in Manila, and apparently they were just second-hand ones, just in poor condition, or as it said here, in knockdown condition, and they were valued at $200 each. So of course the tariff that you pay, if it's a percentage tariff, which they usually are, was very low because they were second-hand rubbish bikes, and so the tax that you would pay on 212, obviously not much. They had a look at them, found out they were brand spanking new, and actually were valued at about 6 times as much, $1,800. And so, of course, the tariff that would have been paid on that would have been a lot higher in dollar terms than for the much lower price. So, again, it is just another one of the ways that firms have used tried to get around these tariffs that have been imposed. There are other ways that they have done, as I said, mentioned. The point is, of course, is that this tax, like all taxes, is an arbitrary value. It doesn't represent a resource allocation as such. It's not labour or capital or raw materials. It's just a number imposed by the government, which created those welfare problems that we've just been talking about. And as far as firms are concerned, it manipulates the price at which they get to sell the good at in the other country, in the country with the tariff. And so the higher the tariffs, the more they're imposed, the more firms will try and get around them, because of course it raises the price and lowers the demand for their products.